passive house has got to be the way of the here and the now and the future. Like, we can't really build any other way. You know, we could use other materials besides timber, but that we need to go to passive house for all the reasons that we know about. You know, the energy efficiency, the thermal comfort. I don't think anyone should be building in any other way myself.
Welcome to the Passive House podcast, brought to you by Passive House Accelerator, a catalyst for zero carbon building. For news, inspiration and connections from all flavours of Passive House, check out passivehouseaccelerator.com. Sign up to receive regular updates about events, get your questions answered and contribute to the community dialogue. There's loads of free information for experienced professionals and people just starting out on their Passive House journey. We hope to see you at one of our weekly Passive House Accelerator live webinars. In the meantime, here's this week's Passive House podcast. Welcome back to the Passive House podcast. I'm Matthew Cutler, Welsh, coming to you from Tamaki Makaurau, Auckland in New Zealand.
And I'm Zach Semke, coming to you from Seattle, Washington, on the Salish Sea.
How's everything there, Zach?
It's good. Exciting times. My oldest is graduating from high school tonight.
Oh, exciting. Congratulations.
Yeah, it's a big deal.
Big step. We got any budding architect or a builder in the works?
I don't think so. I think she's really interested in human biology and specifically like the bioengineering, genetics, the gut biome,
nice.
Culture, food, all sorts of
that kind of tracks.
Really cool stuff.
I'm interested in housing primarily because of health and the influence that our buildings have on health. So it's all related.
Yeah, and buildings have a biome too. So
yes, indeed. Well, it's been wet in this part of the world. I recorded 36 millimeters of rain just overnight last week. But more interestingly, over in Australia, I see that there's a bit of surface flooding in Adelaide in South Australia. So I think there's quite a heavy rain. And the problem with that there is that they went for pretty much 4 months. For the whole of the beginning of this year, so from January almost through to May, it didn't rain once in Adelaide. So they have a very surfaces everywhere. So it doesn't take a lot of rain after those conditions to cause some problems, and that's kind of looks like they might be having a bit of flooding issues there at the moment.
Yeah, well, lots of flooding going on in Florida right now, and then also a major heat dome setting up in on the East Coast. So
it's heat dome season again.
Yeah, I'm afraid so.
Well, we're going to get into talk a little bit about some houses in Australia this week. This project came across my radar a while back in Greenwich Park. We've actually talked about it previously with my conversation with Darren Parkinson, who is the builder. This week we talked to Sue Connor, who's the designer of that project, and we talk a little bit about Passive House and how it fits with the climate in Australia, a much warmer climate, and some of the opportunities and flexibility that offers both architects and designers. So some good stuff to talk about there. Before we get into that, we got some people to thank.
We sure do. So big thank you to the sponsors that make our work at Passive House Accelerator possible, including the Passive House podcast. So thank you to our stakeholder partner, NYSERDA, the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority. Thanks also to our founding sponsors, 475 High Performance Building Supply, Glavel, Ingui Architecture, Minotaur, Partel, Rockwell North America, Stocorp, and Zola Windows. And thanks to our champion sponsors, Bewizo, Gradient, Icon Windows and Doors, Intelligent Membranes, PH Air Seal, and Source 2050.
All right. Well, Sue Connor is a Passive House architect and the founder of Gaea Architects in Australia. I mentioned that I caught up with her after my conversation with Darren, and I wanted to talk to them both to get their perspectives on work that they've done together, because they collaborate quite closely on projects throughout their part of Australia, just around Sydney. So yeah, let's dive in and have a listen to my conversation with Sue Connor.
Thank you, Sue, for joining us on the show. Really nice to chat. Whereabouts are you in the world?
We're on the northern beaches of Sydney. Yeah.
And I spoke to Darren a little earlier on. Are you close by to where he's located?
Well, he lives in Avalon and I grew up in Avalon, so I've got a special affinity with that area, which is just north of I don't know if you know Northern Beaches, but there's Manly and there's Palm Beach, and I'm up the Manly end and he's at the Palm Beach end.
Right. And we talked about the fact that that's a fairly moderate climate, like it's quite nice. It's not too extreme, possibly getting a little bit warmer. Have you spent most of your life in that area?
Yeah, all my life basically.
Right.
Apart from a bit of travelling here and there. Yeah.
Yeah. Tell us about how you got into architecture.
Oh, well, my father is very practical. He loved architecture, and I was the firstborn, and I was brought up in a workshop, basically holding the other piece of the end of the timber with Dad. And then I had a very influential art teacher at school that loved architecture, and she used to give us these amazing lectures with these slideshows with so much passion. Frank Lloyd Wright and Walter Gropius and the Bauhaus, and then the history of architecture. And so that ignited a passion for architecture, I would say, is very influenced by our teachers at high school. Yeah, I always loved art and architecture, and when it came to the crunch, I chose architecture.
That's pretty special to have that experience at high school.
Yeah, it was actually. High school teachers I found a huge influence, because when I went travelling halfway through my architecture degree for a year, looking at buildings, basically, it was the stuff that she'd taught me that I remembered the most. It's interesting,
Yeah, right.
Like it really gets ingrained in the brain when you're younger, probably, what you're exposed to. Yeah.
Where did you go travelling?
Oh, at that time I backpacked for 14 months, but through Europe, Northern Africa, bit of, Israel, Egypt, Turkey, that sort of, yeah.
Do you remember what you noticed about buildings when you stepped outside of Australia?
Well, we went up as far as Lapland and North Scandinavia, so it was amazing. I just love travelling in that, just learning about other people and how they live, just lifestyle. Yeah, every country offered something different, like from the cathedrals in Central Europe and Spain, and then the way every country has a different architecture, of course.
Yeah.
Like when Morocco, how they live compared to, say, Scandinavia. And I think Scandinavia was very interesting because that's where Utzon comes from, who designed the Opera House, and I was very taken with Scandinavia at that time. And also the way they lived and the way they looked after their buildings. Yeah, and also Finland, Alve Aalto and the Scandinavian design, which of course would have been all built along the lines of Passive House back then. It was a long, long time ago. They would have all been built very well.
That was kind of necessity in that sort of harsh climate.
Yeah, and then when you go down to places like Morocco and Egypt, that's responding to the climate as well. Quite different type of climate, but responding well.
It's always interesting moving, because I grew up in Adelaide as well in Australia, but even here in New Zealand, the concept of heritage is quite different when you go to Europe. When an old building in this part of the world is 100 years old, I imagine you saw some that were 1,000 years old. Yeah,
for sure. And then went to Japan on an architectural study tour not long after I got back. I was very, at 22 or 23 years of age, it was an amazing influence on me. think very yeah. And you look at life differently when you travel.
Yeah.
You appreciate different things.
How was sustainability incorporated into your architecture training in Sydney?
How did I get the passion for it, or?
Well, was it there as part of the formal training?
Yeah, well, so I've always been a bit of a mad greenie, and when I was at uni, I did my dissertation, or my thesis was alternative to rainforest timbers, because timber was very much part of my life with my father, who's industrial arts, and I love trees, and so that dissertation had a big influence. I did a couple of subjects at uni, and at that time they were doing the green bans in Sydney, and also there were big protests going on with the Franklin River and down in Tassie being dammed, and also I got involved in that, and also Mount Nardi up in, anything to do with deforestation I was pretty passionate about. So, and then health and well-being has been my other passion, so that it sort of ties together. I've just always it's been what I really love the most, is caring about the planet and ourselves, besides architecture is a means to facilitating that.
When did you first hear about Passive House?
Well, Darren, I've known Darren for quite a long time from Eclipse Passive House. I mean, he had another company called Your Abode. So we met probably at least 10 years ago, and we just got together, and he's almost like he was finishing my sentences. We were so into the same things, like non-toxic buildings, ethical building materials, and, sustainable building material. So, and he's got a wealth of knowledge, and it was, we just sort of got on, and we started working together. And he was sort of filling me in what he was doing, and he was building to the Passive House standard, and realised that, at that time he wasn't actually getting them certified, and then realised, we have to go all out and do the PHPP and make sure we're getting buildings certified to ensure that they're totally healthy and they're performing to the capacity that they need to. So it was Darren really that got me. He just said, he took me along for the ride type thing.
Right.
Yeah. So he would come into our office down at Bayview, Pittwater, and so excited with what was happening, and his ideas of doing the prefabricated, because he realised when he was doing it off-site that the taping and was very labour intensive, and you just can't get an apprentice to do that.
Right.
So it was much better to do it prefabricated in a factory, and that's when he developed the system to build the buildings off-site.
And how's that changed your workflow?
Our workflow's different, and that I'm actually being a lot more discerning what I take on. Now, especially, it's taken me a long time after 34 years of business. I just really want to do passive houses, and that's about it. I do help people out with master planning and a few other things that, is helpful, but that's my passion. I just want to do passive house. Yeah.
And with the prefab element, does that change the way you design?
To a point, and also when it comes to budget constraints. So we're doing a very large multi-million-dollar passive house on the headland on the Northern Beaches, and we're not keeping to a lot of the rules, but you do pay for that. But it's still working out a similar, if not even less, amount per square metre to a conventional build. So a lot of the clients we're getting through now have got fairly strict budget. So Darren has developed this system where there's fair few rules we have to keep to ensure that we meet the budget. And that's one of the reasons we like working as a team, because that's when we got together, is that we don't want to disappoint people. We want to serve people, and we're very upfront from the beginning. So the traditional architect builder model I grew tired of a long time ago, because the going to tender with 3 builders and negotiating the contract, and then ultimately often it leads to variations and people were unhappy because of the cost blowouts and things like that, whereas you work in collaboration together from the start to ensure that we don't get those nasty surprises.
Right.
So it does mean, like, you know, and people always want to push outside the box, and I do too. Architects do. Like they want to break a few rules, and it all goes back to what can fit on a semi-trailer at the moment with and be practical to prefabricate in a way. So the windows we're using, a lot of them are, if you go too big, which we like large areas of glass, you know, it's heavy, and just craning it onto site, and so a lot of the windows can come in the panel delivered, but if they get too big, then they have to be inserted when you're on site, and there's an extra cost because of that.
Right. So you've outlined some constraints there from knowing that you're designing a prefabricated building, but does that limit you in terms of what you can deliver for your clients?
Well, if you spoke, like we went to the Architecture Awards last year, we got nominated, we got shortlisted, but when you look at what an architect can do, like as a sculptural form, right, a lot of the architecture world is a bit behind when it comes to the passive house, that's for sure. What am I trying to say? In that creativity, you don't have the creativity that you like. If you look at some buildings that are like with lots and lots of areas of glass and lots of thermal bridges, they're not going to perform. They're not going to be comfortable, but they look amazing.
Right.
You know,
look good on the front of a magazine.
Yeah, and you know they might, but they're not energy efficient really, and they're not healthy, and a lot of them, because you get mold and condensation and dust and all those type of things that create allergies. So you know, ideally, like when you do the passive house course, they say perfect passive house is a box, because every time you turn a corner, it creates a thermal bridge, as you know.
Yeah.
So you can imagine, like my house that I'm in here was designed like 30 years ago, and it's basically like living in a tent. So it's got lots of thermal bridges everywhere because there's lots of turns, and it's a L shape. Yeah, there's no way you could even bring it up to the passive house standard. So yeah, like you have to be restrained a little bit. But the house I've been speaking to you about at Newport, it's quite sculptural, and it's got big cantilevers, and it's breaking out of the passive house rules quite a lot, and that's challenging for us all, but we enjoy that. That's the thing, that we do like breaking the rules a bit to see how far we can push passive house.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about Greenwich Park, because do you call that Greenwich Park or the Tarlow River?
Either one.
Project. I mean, it's stunning, and I don't think anyone looking at those images would think that you've been constrained in any way with regards to natural light, the size of the windows, even the form factor. I mean, is it a U shape? I mean, it's a pavilion style house, isn't it?
Yeah, that was challenging, because it broke the rules of passive.
Yeah.
Because we had three pavilions we've got three pavilions with interlinking sort of corridors, and it was challenging, and that's why we enjoyed it too, because it wasn't like the easy solution was a box for that site, but the courtyard design challenged us all, but it was worth it.
Oh, it's amazing, and it definitely challenges that paradigm of a square box of a passive house, because you've got quite a lot of surface area, I imagine, and quite a lot of glazed area, but it's certified. So I'm assuming that it works. It's got a fireplace, which I'm not sure how much that gets.
They love using it. They use it a lot. Because it creates that ambience too. So.
Right. Yeah.
It's a passive fireplace.
Yeah. I'm really fascinated by some of your other designs because they are very unique.
Mm-hmm.
Have you thought about what you see as an emerging vernacular of Australian passive house?
No, I haven't actually consciously thought about it. It's more like architects sort of respond to each site and the needs of the client, I suppose, and depending on where it's positioned. So say the Greenwich Park house, that was based on more farmhouse sort of buildings, like the sheds in the Kangaroo Valley house. That was driven a lot by the client and the landscape as well. That's another courtyard house. Again, comes outside the box of normal passive house. And then the Newport house is responding to that environment, the northern beaches of Sydney environment.
Yeah, I mean, looking at the renders and images you have on your website, people would drive past any of those houses and have no idea that there was a passive house, in a good way.
Mm.
I would imagine, because they're an architectural, piece of interest. They're works of art, but they don't look out of place, and they certainly don't look like a big box with small windows.
Oh yeah, definitely don't want it. I wouldn't be interested in doing that all the time. I mean, we do. I wouldn't like to do small windows.
Right. Well, especially in places like those environments that your clients are in, Northern Beach. I mean, I imagine the views. Well, in fact, I really like, that's another feature I like about the Tarlo River one, is that some of the images are of the view through the window, which is just a really good example of good design, I think, where the window is well positioned to capture that view without being excessive.
Yeah, goes back to, I had this fantastic lecture in first year architecture, Michael Tawa. I'll never, again, you remember he talks about framing views, like that idea that if you come around a corner and another view opens up by a window that's framed a view, rather than having a whole heap of glass where you see everything at the same time. So using a window to frame, to almost like create a painting.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
That's
coming back to delivery, do clients choose you now, or what's the process for a client working with yourself and with Darren?
We sort of, I mean, as I said, I've been a long time in this game, and I'm not very good at the marketing side of things. Everything's got to be, you're meant to do a blog every week and keep up to date with all your social media and everything. Yeah. So I suppose people find me either, through word of mouth or through Darren, or, I have been, as part of Sanctuary magazine for years and years. Yeah, I've had a partnership. I've had quite a number of staff, and now I keep it fairly simple. It's just me and one other, and we just take on like-minded people these days that nice. we can help. Yeah.
And are those clients aware, or is prefabrication part of their consciousness in their decision making, or is that just how the house gets delivered and it's not really part of what drives them?
I would say the way we present ourselves is, if someone contacts me, I say we work collaboratively. We don't work in part. We work as a team. Darren's named it the integrative design process. So nice. I would normally bring Darren in very early to meet the client and say this is part of how we work now, because we're going to do passive house. It's a team effort, and I don't really want to work in isolation anymore in that regard. So people are basically taking on the team, and and I would say that a lot of the feedback we're getting is they really like the fact that we're working together from the start, and we're looking after them to ensure that we meet, particularly when it comes to their budget. And I would say that the prefab is people are very curious about it and quite taken with that idea of prefabrication. Yeah.
Does it affect their budget, do you know, or is it just part of the process now? It doesn't really impact it?
You meaning like make it less or more type thing?
Yeah, does it save, or is it just the way you deliver?
I would say, I haven't done other passive buildings without Darren, so I don't.
Right. Yeah.
I don't really know that how they compare price-wise, but I believe it's really good value for money from working on conventional buildings for most of my life. And people say, oh, that's expensive. I go, actually, it's not. You're getting, you pay the same, if not more, for a conventional build. So the bonus of the prefab is that it is precision building, and it's basically precision building. It's a little bit faster in that you can be doing it's exciting when it comes up really quickly in 2 weeks.
Yeah.
And people love that. Then it takes quite a bit of time to finish it.
Yeah.
But that 2-week window when the panels arrive on site and they go up that quickly, it's very exciting for everyone. Yeah. So I think that is pretty enticing for people.
Yeah.
And people are some people are choosing to go own a builder. So we can design up the building and Darren will provide the building to site and then they'll finish it off.
Yep.
They'll do it.
Yeah, I think that's quite a nice solution too.
Mm.
Where to from here, Sue? You mentioned that you're sort of just in a nice place now where you work with people that you want to work with. What's the future look like for you? And also what do you see the future being for prefabricated passive house in your region?
That's a big question. Future for me personally, I've just, as you know, I've changed my business 5 years ago or so from Sue Connor to Gaea. I'm really into helping the planet. I would say I'll be just doing more and more of that, just focusing on what I can do to help the planet. I'd like to have the business going enough that I can maybe take a little bit of a step back and I have got another architect helping me and I'll probably get another one or two. It'd be good just to keep it chugging along. And I'd like to focus on wellness and, consulting as I get further on in my years. The world's changing really fast with AI and stuff. It's really quite incredible. So who knows where to from here?
Right.
In that, just keep getting blown away with what's possible.
Yeah.
The world we're going into is going to be quite different, and I feel that passive house has got to be the way of the here and the now and the future. We can't really build any other way. Materials besides timber, but we need to go to passive house for all the reasons that we know about. The energy efficiency, the thermal comfort. I don't think anyone should be building in any other way myself. So.
And you're getting feedback from your clients about how they're performing during the summer as well?
Yeah, well, the Greenwich Park house, they've been very happy with it. The summer, they actually haven't finished. They've still got to finish they have a pergola off the front that needs to provide more shade that hasn't been finished. They didn't feel that they needed to do it, and I said, you need to do it. Right. So I think that, it can get a bit warm until they put that deciduous vine pergola at the front.
Nice.
But those guys were living in a shed before they moved into that house. They were living in a farm shed. So they imagined that they were going to open windows and feel the outside, but they have been very happy living in a T-shirt all year round. And that place, and Greenwich Park is notorious for extremes in temperature, 40 degrees down to below zero. So that's been quite an interesting experience to hear how much they love living in it without having to open it all up.
Was that deciduous canopy part of your PHPP model?
Yeah, I think it was included.
It was. So you allowed for...
We still met it. I think we still got the certification even though, yeah.
Right. But in your modelling, did you allow for a different amount of shading in winter and summer?
Oh, no, I don't think Scott did actually. No, I don't think he did actually. I had it on the drawings, but I don't think he included it.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. Interesting. No, I know that's an emerging space, is really looking at optimising for those summer conditions, which is exciting, I think, to see where that's going in this part of the world.
Yeah, just that merging of passive solar and passive design, It needs to, you need to do both really.
So any thoughts on Frank Lloyd Wright now with your experience?
What you mean, being inspired by him?
Yeah, potentially.
Oh, I think Frank Lloyd Wright, I mean, he's amazing architect. I mean, you know what, even that, like to say the fireplace, that's a Frank Lloyd Wright thing, that it's the heart of the home.
Yeah.
And we don't need one in a passive house, but I understand why people want one.
Yep.
You know, which
definitely.
is, it creates that, you know, it just gives you that ambience. And that's a very Frank Lloyd Wright design feature.
Yeah.
And just that idea of being one with nature and being inspired by nature. Yeah.
Definitely. Well, that's definitely the impression I get from looking at your images, and I'll put some links to those so people can have a look, see what we're talking about, and because they are really, really beautiful. And I agree. A lot of architects talk about buildings, working with their surroundings, and I think you really have captured that.
Thanks, Matthew.
Thank you, Sue. I really appreciate it. Keep up the good work, and I look forward to seeing more of your projects.
Thanks so much, Matthew. Appreciate your time.
And that was Sue Connor of Gaea Architects, and we'll put some links in the show notes so people can see some of the projects, and particularly the Tarlow River or Greenwich Park Passive House that we were describing there. I don't know if you've had a chance to look at that one, Zach?
I have. It's stunning. It's so beautiful.
It's a pretty beautiful setting. There's some. It's very Australian looking. There's a lot of native bush, forest in the background. It's quite arid kind of environment, and you get the feeling that place could get very cold in the winter, but could also be pretty hot in the summer. And looking through the portfolio and the photos of that, I'm struck by the size of windows for a start. And as I talked about in the conversation, the shape of that house is very much a U shape, and we talked about breaking the rules of passive house. It is a certified passive house, and really what we were discussing, what I was suggesting, is it breaks the stereotype of a passive house being a simple box with small windows, because this isn't neither of those things. It's a pavilion design. There's lots of glass, and there's really well placed glass, and we've talked about this before about designers being clever with where they put windows to focus attention on a view and also provide natural daylight and all the other benefits of that. But there are some big windows in this house.
Yeah, I think one of those must be 5 feet tall by, I don't know, 9 feet long. It's quite large.
Except it'd be in meters.
Because it's in meters, right? Yeah, fair enough. What ifs, man? Yeah, I mean, like strictly speaking, the rules of passive house are three: that it needs to be airtight, it needs to have very low demand for heating and cooling, and it needs to have very low total energy demand. But we do think of one of the kind of, I guess, unspoken rules or a kind of best practice is to keep the form of the building really simple, the boxy but beautiful concept that Bronwyn Barry talks about a lot. And so that was definitely, that was the rule that is clearly broken by Greenwich Park and some of the other projects that are on the Gaea website. So, I mean, I think it demonstrates again that there's a lot of design flexibility in passive house practice, and particularly if you have the budget to make those moves. It's not, like the most economical kind of resource and dollar kind of efficient approach is going to be more compact and boxy. But you don't have to do it that way.
Yeah, and I'm very conscious of the fact that we are looking at pretty high-end architecture here, beautiful architecture, very bespoke architecture. And our challenge always is to say, well, how do we translate this to a wider audience? And it's all well and good for people who have the means to have a beautiful house in a beautiful location and have an architect and a builder dedicated to doing their bidding and creating a beautiful place. But we also need to figure out how to do that for the masses as well. I think there's some really, I'm just really continually encouraged and inspired by what's going on specifically in Australia with how some passive house architects are doing what Sue has done here and design something that does not look like a passive house in the traditional sense, in the traditional European sense, and makes it perform, but really responds well to that natural environment and to create these amazing living spaces and incorporate things like, I mean, we talk about indoor-outdoor flow a lot in this part of the world and have these big sweeping doors and windows that connect a living space out to an outdoor area. That's a very common feature of designs with the, for a lot of time of the year, the outdoor conditions are quite conducive to having large parts of the house open. So it's cool to think of ways that can facilitate that style of living, but it still needs to be able to be closed when it's closed. And I guess that's the difference with these types of houses than just a standard house, is that you're using good doors and windows that do seal properly. And that's probably one of the main differences in the detail.
Yeah, I mean, sign me up. I'd love to move down and live in that place.
It's pretty out there. It looks kind of remote.
Yeah, as long as there's some broadband, we're good.
Yeah, well, we did mention briefly about resilience as well, and that is becoming a more and more topical. And of course, the ability for a passive house to be resilient in terms of looking after itself and looking after the people, if things like power, water, internet get cut off for a period of time, the conditions in a passive house are going to be much more conducive to comfort, whatever time of the year, because that could just as easily happen in a hot period in places like Australia. Power cuts are just as likely in summer as they are in winter. So being able to perform and maybe generate some of your own power, store some of your own water, becoming more and more appealing to people. So they're talking about sustainability and resilience as two separate features.
That feels like a little foreshadowing of the conversation that I just had with Lisa White from FIAS, the associate director at FIAS. I just spoke with her a couple of days ago, so we'll be rolling out the episode in the next week or two. But there's just a big focus both with FIAS's new retrofit standard, or revision of their retrofit standard, Revive, as well as Lisa's work on the role that passive buildings can play in terms of grid resilience and in microgrids. Just that theme of both resilience to help us adapt to the climate impacts that we're already seeing and that will increase, and then also a real focus on carbon, of course, and the climate mitigation. Trying to solve the problem at the root cause. So.
That sounds good. And speaking of upcoming interviews, we've got an upcoming series.
We do, yeah. So we have a circular construction series that's about to get released. We have 3 episodes of featuring interviews by Mary James and Ilka Cassidy of leaders around the world in circular construction. So that's another thing to look forward to as the summer approaches. And then after that, we'll be looking at a whole series of episodes throughout the summer about clever ways to keep buildings cool. So looking at passive buildings and passive strategies, as well as high performance mechanical systems. So good geeky stuff.
Cool. And you're taking a bit of a break now for a couple of weeks?
I am, yeah. So, well, both the accelerator will this week. So maybe I'll say that first, is that this coming week we don't have a Passive House Accelerator live on Wednesday, June 19th, because that's Juneteenth, which celebrates the effective end of slavery in the United States. And so we'll be taking the Wednesday off in observance of Juneteenth. And then I will be in Japan for a couple weeks with my family. My son just is finishing 5th grade elementary school, and he did a Japanese immersion program, so he gets to do a trip to Japan and a homestay, and we're gonna accompany him on that trip. So
awesome!
I'll be away for a couple weeks.
Very good. All right, but we will have some episodes coming out in the meantime. We've got some lined up, ready to go. So while it's a bit of downtime for the accelerator, there will still be regular episodes each week on the Passive House podcast. So have a great time in Japan, Zach.
Thank you, Matthew.
And we'll be back with another episode on the podcast next week.